Happy Vietnam Veterans Day. Our Vietnam veterans are a special group of veterans, and they're the only ones who have one day, March 29th, dedicated to them. And I think there's a good reason for that. The Vietnam veterans are special and different from other veterans, mainly because of the trauma they suffered, not in the war, but when they came home. Vietnam veterans were people who fought in a increasingly unpopular, brutal, long war that was ultimately unsuccessful. And they came home to an ungrateful nation that seemed to blame the warriors for the war that they didn't like. And that trauma really stuck with our Vietnam veterans, and I think shaped in many ways the rest of their lives and what they've become. And what they've become is really something extraordinary, different from other generations of veterans. It's the Vietnam veterans who are most dedicated to connecting to all veterans of all eras and ages. Vietnam veterans are the ones who go to nursing homes and sit with World War II and Korean War veterans. In fact, a Korean War veteran once told me that he would never have been involved in any veterans organizations if it had not been for Vietnam veterans reaching out to him and recognizing that his war, the Korean War, was similar in many respects to Vietnam. Americans weren't really paying attention to the Korean War, and Korean War veterans came home to a nation that didn't celebrate them or even ask them questions about their service. Vietnam veterans are also the ones who go to airports to welcome home our young servicemen and women when they're coming home from wars in the Middle East. So Vietnam veterans are very much deserving of their own special day. But why March 29th? That puzzles a lot of people, including some Vietnam veterans. And it is a problem with the Vietnam War. As many of you know, I taught a course on the history of the Vietnam War for many times, and often it's a confusing war to teach. And I think the public has a difficult time commemorating the war because it was a sprawling war across decades, really. And it doesn't have a neat beginning and end point. Like, the Civil War has the firing upon Fort Sumter in 1861, and it has the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865. World War II has Pearl Harbor in 1941 and the Japanese surrender and the German surrender in 1945. The Vietnam War doesn't have those neat bookends. Its problem is actually it has too many bookends. You could say that the Vietnam War began in 1945 or 1946 with the breakout of the First Indochina War and the U.S. support for the French Empire in that war. You could say that certainly U.S. involvement deepened dramatically in 1954 with the end of the First Indochina War and the French defeat there. 1955, the U.S. really ramped up participation in supporting the new government of South Vietnam as distinct from the communist government of North Vietnam. 1964 was the year that the air war really expanded. 1965 was when the ground war expanded. And if I were to choose a date that was the beginning of the Vietnam War, it would be March 8th, 1965, because that was the date that the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade, 3,500 strong, landed at Red Beach, Da Nang, and they were the first troops authorized for offensive operations in Vietnam. So March 8th, 1965 is a really important kind of start date of the war. An end date, I think, is a little easier. It's April 30th, 1975 with the fall of Saigon. But by that time, the U.S. was not directly involved in the war. We'd been out for 2 years. So that wouldn't really be an appropriate date. And it really wouldn't be appropriate to kind of choose a day to honor our Vietnam veterans. A date when the communist North took over the South and reunified the country under a single communist government, which was the very thing that our servicemen and women were over there to prevent. So that wouldn't be an appropriate date to use. You can't really use March 8th, 1965, because that stands as the beginning of the Lyndon Johnson policy of gradually escalating the war, a policy that proved unfruitful, not successful. And so, that's a date that has negative connotations attached to it, as do the other important dates of the Vietnam War. I mean, you could use a date from the Tet Offensive, say January 30th or 31st, 1968, or the date of the invasion of Cambodia. Those are big, important dates in the history of the war, but they're dates that caused dissension and strife here at home. And so it's really hard to find a date to honor our Vietnam veterans that doesn't have negative connotations to it. And I do think March 29th is the best date for that, because that is a date that really focuses on the homecoming, which was the central, I think, distinct experience of Vietnam veterans. March 29th, 1973 was the date that was specified in the Paris Peace Accords of 1973, which were signed on January 27, 1973. And in the Paris Peace Accords, it laid out specifically that 60 days after this, these accords go into effect, the U.S. will remove all its combat operations. It'll dismantle MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, and remove, any kind of American combatant presence in Vietnam. So that ended up being March 30th, and the day before, to make sure that the Americans met the deadline, they left Vietnam, Saigon, on March 29th. So the Paris Peace Accords, very important historically, but the Paris Peace Accords is really what determined that date. It was a peace treaty that ended the war in Vietnam. It brought neither peace nor accord to Vietnam, but it did provide a temporary ceasefire that neither side really adhered to for very long. It secured, very importantly, the return of 591 American POWs being held in the North, and it gave that date of March 30th, March 29th, when the U.S. would remove its remaining 23,700 or so servicemen and women in Vietnam. So that's why March 29th has been chosen for Vietnam Veterans Day, the day they all came home. And we should all say welcome home to every Vietnam veteran we see on that day or any day, because that was a welcome that they did not get when they returned home. We have had some veterans at the Veterans Breakfast Club share their stories of that date. One in particular, Sam Wilson, he was stationed at MACV headquarters in Saigon, and he remembers bugging out, leaving on March 29th, being one of the last servicemen to leave Vietnam on March 29th, 1973. And he shared his story at one of our events, and he remembered going to a Class 6 right before he got on a Braniff Airlines plane. And a Class 6 is a military liquor store, and I'll let him tell the story.
March 29th, everybody had to be out by the 30th, so we left on the 29th. Stopped by the Class 6 store, which was selling everything for $1. The guy in there knew exactly what he was doing. He says, first, before you come in here, go next door and buy yourself the largest bottle of Listerine they have. Dump it out on your way back. Come in here, get the best whiskey you can buy, fill the bottle. That's the only way you can get on the plane. And by the time we got to Guam, we just stayed on the plane.
So you were truly one of the last American servicemen in Vietnam.
We left 50 people there when the day was over. So yes, it was a very interesting day. We went out to the airplane. The airplane was too big to park where planes normally park at Ton Son. And we asked, what's going on here? They said, don't worry about it. So they drove and drove and drove. We drove clear down the end of Ton Son Air Base, and there sat an orange Braniff 747. Needless to say, we got on that Braniff.
All right, thank you for joining us for this little Veteran Story History Minute. And if you want to hear more, just subscribe or follow the Veterans Breakfast Club on your favorite social media platform, and we will see you soon.